Welcome to Mystery Wire with George Knapp. This podcast is dedicated to reports on Area 51, UFOs, military technology, paranormal, mysteries, and just great news stories. You found your place for interviews and special investigations into a diverse universe of strange, unknown, and unsettling subjects. Welcome to Mystery Wire.
I do like the just great news stories there at the end of that intro, of that open. George Knapp, Ron Futrell, glad to have you with us here.
Hey, Ron.
Sometimes it's just great news stories that you find, that you come up with, that Mystery Wire will populate. Would you say?
Yeah, the website, I mean, as we envision it, we still have a long way to go in loading content up there and just archive after archive of stuff that we've covered the last 30 plus years. And although the emphasis for a lot of people will be UFOs, paranormal, weird stuff, a lot of it is just, as you said, just good news stories, mysteries. You know, eventually we expect to delve into missing persons, and Paul Fronczak is an example of that. We covered Paul Fronczak and the mystery surrounding his birth family. You know, he was 48 years old when he realized he wasn't really Paul Fronczak after all, that he didn't know who his real parents were, didn't know what happened to the actual Paul Fronczak after a kidnapping in 1964 that became a national story. So we've done a lot of reporting on that, and that will be something they're going to add to the website eventually. So it expands a lot further beyond just aliens.
No, I've seen some of those Paul Fronczak stories and going through some of the material. Just absolutely fascinating and gripping. The first time I saw it, and you're going to learn more about it. And I know there's some national stuff being done on this. When I say national stuff, everything's international for that matter. Okay, we're saying national stuff, but you've been interviewed by an organization that's putting together more on this story. So if you don't recognize the name Paul Fronczak now, you will know it in the future, and you will see it on Mystery Wire, because it's just riveting. A guy that thought he was somebody else for his entire, he's 48 years old, until modern DNA comes. Now we get into the science part of this, because it was through DNA matches that he was able to eventually find out more information about his life, whether he wanted to know it or not, and that becomes part of the story too, because it's a thrill ride for him.
Yeah, so we've covered it for 7 or 8 years, somewhere in that area, and have done a lot of stories and have been along the ride, as he tries to figure out who he really was, who his birth parents were, whether he has siblings. He didn't know his nationality. He didn't know his birth date. He didn't even know his real age. So it's a journey of discovery for him as he's been going along, and we've sort of been a fly on the wall as that process has unfolded, and helped him as well. I mean, the website that we put up became a clearinghouse for tips and hints and information, and a lot of it's come in over the years. It's still up there, and so we'll be posting all of those Paul Fronczak stories on the website in the near future, and other related kind of mysteries.
And as promised, we're going to have part 2 of our Bob Stodahl interview. We had part 1. You can go back and listen to it here on the podcast, because they're archived, they're podcasts, that's what we do. So you can go back there and listen to part 1. We're going to have part 2 here in just a little bit. We'll fire that up and let you listen to the former news director here at 8 News Now at Channel 8 in Las Vegas that worked closely with George on this story, on mob stories, and all sorts of stuff. And he's got some interesting perspectives, having listened to it previously and knowing Bob personally. It's fun to hear what his take is on all of this stuff, and how a young George Knapp came, if you will, how a young George Knapp came to be, that he was there at the beginning.
Well, I had told you before that Bob had an interest in Area 51 before I came along. I mean, by the time I got hired at Channel 8 in 1981, he already had a little file. And in fact, I went after last week, us talking about on the podcast, I went and found part of that original file. It's written in Stodahlese. Oh. You probably need carbon dating to check the accuracy of how old this paper is.
That's an old manual typewriter there, by the way, too.
That's also the old Channel 8 logo on it. Yes. That used to be the big, strong 8 that we had. So this is some classic stuff, as Bob was putting together the first journalistic history of Area 51 back in the late 70s, early 80s. And, you know,
when the government was saying it wasn't there.
Oh, yeah.
And they were serious about that. It wasn't just like sort of fun. In the 90s, it got sort of as a joke almost. And the baseball team names itself here in town, the 51s. So everybody knew it was there. But back then, the government, you got to understand the context. They were serious about saying this place did not exist. And you people that say it does are nuts.
Pretty much, pretty close to that. I mean, it was on maps for a while. I've got a phone book that listed the numbers from Area 51 and the different departments and things like that. And despite that, they claimed that it didn't exist. And it vanished from maps, and nobody could tell their spouses they worked there. So there was an aura of mystery surrounding the place, regardless of whether you think there's flying saucers out there or not. They certainly had advanced technology. And if you were to have a recovered disc or some kind of alien technology, that would be the place that you would likely take it to figure it out. Stoddal, of course, was skeptical. That was his job, So he and I went up to meet Bob Lazar. That was sort of what we talked about in the last podcast, up to the time when we went up to interview Bob and get a sense of whether he was telling the truth or not. And we put him through his paces, and then we walked out and had this conversation about whether to proceed with a much larger project. And, I was cocky enough at the time and had learned just enough about UFOs and the UFO mystery to figure what this really needs is a good journalist. Give me 6 months and I'll have this all figured out. And here it is 30 plus years later, and I know even less now than I did then. I mean, I certainly haven't cracked the mystery. I've learned a lot about it and have figured out what's true and what isn't in some cases, but it's still a mystery all this time later. But Bob was, he was my mentor, my employer, my boss, my friend, my role model in a lot of ways. He was also my editor. So anything that went on the air at Channel 8 in those days, it had to pass through Bob Stoddal, and he was a tough editor. Today we have anybody with a typewriter, they bang stuff out and put it online, and they think they're a journalist. It's not quite the same as working for a news organization, especially one that's headed by a tough newsman like him. So I knew we had to do it right. And I knew that he had an interest in this, and he was going to be looking over my shoulder the whole way. So in this conversation, we kind of get into what steps we're going to have to follow, how careful we're going to have to be. Because, we knew the risks. We're tackling something that a lot of people would say is crazy. And if it crashes and burns, it would affect the credibility of our news operation, of our station, maybe forever. So we had to be careful.
And yourself, you're a young journalist at that time. You're not George Knapp. You're not George Knapp at that time in all caps. You were finding your way in that sense in this city, in this town. You had the mob to cover. You were doing the job with that. Ned Day was involved in that. Obviously, the station was leading the way in that. One of the things that Bob talks about at the start of this interview, we'll play it in just a moment, but he also talks about the other stations here in town and whether he thought they might think that we're nuts doing this. And I worked at one of the other stations in town at the time, the ABC station back then, while you were at the CBS station. Now, I was doing sports, so I was more interested. That was the glory days of the Rebels. So UNLV basketball was on my mind then. But I knew and I saw from a distance a little bit and saw the reports and was glued to listening and watching these reports because it interested me at the time. It still does, obviously. But you didn't care. You didn't. If you did care, you didn't show it. You seemed to say, "Wait a second. This is what we're doing. This is where I'm going." You have to have a bit of fearlessness to do what you do. Is that right?
Yeah, it was risky. It was definitely a roll of the dice. And but what kept us going is what we talk about, what you'll hear Bob talking about in this conversation coming up. What if it's true? And that's what we were asking ourselves as we left that meeting at John Lear's house, where we first encountered Bob Lazar in person.
And what if it's true that at Area 51 there is what Bob Lazar said, 9 spacecraft out there from alien origin or origin that he couldn't explain?
Yeah. Okay. What if that is true? And then we sort of plotted a course about how to tackle the larger question, not just Bob Lazar and Area 51 and recovered aliens, but the larger questions surrounding the UFO mystery. Tens of thousands of witnesses, maybe millions earth-wide who have seen these things and reported them. 9 out of 10 are misidentifications, but it's also true that 9 out of 10 are not reported at all. Are all these people crazy? A lot of them could be honestly mistaken, but we wanted to evaluate the state of the evidence at that time, the best evidence, physical evidence, photographs, video, witness testimony, landing site trace cases, whatever we could get. And that's what we ended up putting into our series. And this is what Bob talks about in this interview.
And this interview was done when? How long ago?
About 2 months ago.
Okay, so very, very recent interview. This is George Knapp talking to Bob Stoddall, who was the news director here at Channel 8 at that time. And so we'll kick it off with George talking to Bob. Take it away.
We also had an early conversation about, well, look, if we can substantiate this, or any part of it, I mean, the implications are huge. We could make a multi-part series out of it. These could be, you said, these could be 5 minutes long a night at one point.
Well, I think that was a little bit later on, a little bit later on down the line, when, first of all, there was a lot of interest in the interview, a lot of public interest. What media interest there was sort of these guys at what is Channel 8 doing? What's all that about? And there was limited. I think the other stations in town were laughing at us. We continued to do the story. We continued to add bits and pieces of facts and so there was, no, that doesn't fit, this fits, this is a piece of information, this is the date, it matches the date that he said that this, so all of a sudden we now have a stack of stuff that is factually backed up. Some limited confirmation that he worked at Area 51. Just the fact that we even had limited information that he worked at Area 51 was good enough for me, because to get any information, anybody worked at Area 51, turns out there was a phone book, but there was no phone book that here's the employees at Area 51 and here's what they do. But there was bits and pieces that were enough. And occasionally we'd run into, when I say we, I'm really referring to you, we'd run into a roadblock to where I didn't quite check out. And so there were still questions, but then there was this whole body of evidence, of documentation, of interest that the federal government had done over the years, and all with lingering questions. Operation Blue Book, how redacted was that to begin with?
So from May to November, we got an interview with him on camera, that showed his face.
Right.
He agreed to do that because he wanted to save his life. He was afraid that they were going to wipe him out, that something might happen to him. So that was insurance. He agreed to do that. We were not allowed to broadcast it. You can have it, but don't air it. And for 7.5 months, we worked on filling in the blanks and also learning the much bigger picture about UFOs. Read everything.
Right.
Every government document, we read every book we could get our hands on. The idea being, look, we can't go out in the desert and find UFOs, but we can follow the paper trail and do what journalists do. Try to verify what we can about him, about the bigger picture. Is there really a cover-up? Have they been lying to us? And it turned out, yes.
Well, there was exactly what took place. We went out and we had a good start, in the sense that we already had Area 51. We already had that little file, we already had U2, and we already knew that factually the place existed. And so then there was library work, was going out, and every now and then you'd find a piece of information that we could add over here, and the jigsaw puzzle would start to take place. That's something, start to take shape, that something, in fact, was going on at the test site. A lot of big pieces to the puzzle were missing. But this piece, even though it's missing, well, I can see the other pieces around that, what that could be. And I remember him saying, backtracking to what you said, he did the interview with you was protection. I say, what, we agreed not to put it on the air? What, are you crazy? Why did we agree to that? And you know, there were any number of conversations that dead ends, things, avenues that opened up.
The first time he drew the craft for you, remember that?
I wanted him to. Now, I know you had plenty of questions, and so and you went and found some answers, but I still, it was still gnawing at me. Come on, I need to have some piece of. I'm bought in, folks, but show me something that, and so it was basically an almond shaped thing with some additional detail. He was hesitant to do it. But he did, and the fact that he went ahead and did that, even though it didn't show me the inner workings, and there wasn't some big-eyed, bug-eyed aliens that he was drawing, it was enough, and it was scientific enough in my limited scope that it added to the credibility.
He agreed to polygraph tests, more than one.
Right.
He took us to Los Alamos, which denied that he was there. We found him in a phone book. We got an ID number for him. There was a newspaper article on the front page of the Los Alamos paper that says he's a physicist at Los Alamos, and it showed him with his rocket car. And the premise being, if he was allowed to work at classified stuff in a technical or scientific position at Los Alamos, it's at least conceivable he could work out there in the Nevada desert.
Right. Those are the things that kept our engine moving forward. Okay, so that fits in. Again, this is a giant puzzle, but the pieces kept falling into place. One more fact goes there, this goes there, and the story starts having corners and developing. Now each one of those little things we can drill down on. The Los Alamos story, the jet car, I mean, all the other things that he had an interest in, and some challenging things that he was involved with, where he was accounting for a lady of the night. The fact is, we reported all that stuff. I will have to say that all through this, both of us, I think, I'm sure, our credibility was important in this, and we needed to make sure that as we delved into UFOs, we maintained our credibility.
Well, we knew it was a risk.
Yeah.
It's a risk if you don't do it right.
Right, and I think I'm looking in the mirror and telling myself I think we did it right. I think for the most part we were able to do it correctly and quite frankly gave credibility to the whole UFO subject matter. That here's a journalist that is using standard traditional journalistic techniques to get to the bottom of the story, and here's what he has found. Then taking that and looking back at other stories that have come up through the UFO circle, but they were done by not less than credible, but by people that were not in sort of the mainstream media. So there were other pieces, and so our puzzle, people had worked on these stories for years or decades. That information came our way, and we were able to plug that into our piece.
November rolls around.
Right.
We want to go forward with the story.
Right.
We talk Lazara into sitting down and giving us another interview.
Okay.
More detail that we can incorporate into a series. And the series isn't a week-long series, it's a 2-week series.
Well, you think
because we collected so much by then.
The series that it was, there was a lot of material, and we had been broadcasting at Channel 8 these bits and pieces at different times. And there was really a need to give some continuity to it, to give some A to B to C, some chronology, some
Put it in context.
And so we decided that we would do a series, but in order to do this, we also needed to break some boundaries, and that was a traditional multi-part series would run about 2.5, 3.5 minutes each night. That was the standard advice that news consultants, and was used around the country, not much longer than 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes. Well, our decision was to break that mold, and the stories that you wrote and produced, that we broadcast, were 6 minutes or 7 minutes or 9 minutes or 12 or 14 minutes. And what occurred was the community in Las Vegas wanted to hear the story, they wanted to see the story, and they tuned in night after night after night after night, whether it was 6 minutes or 14 minutes. And so by Thursday of that week, I think I asked you if you had any more, and you said there's a lot more. So I think that story went on. We may have lost a bit of the chronology that we had in the first 5 parts, but there were big hunks of the story that would stand alone, and that's what occurred the next week. And I think the stories of the following week, because of the you had to say, bring the audience along, and you couldn't just do that with a one-liner. It had to be a paragraph or two. It had to be, oh, now I get it. Okay. And so the audience just liked that type of journalism. They wanted information on the topic. And so those stories ran 10, 12 minutes for the rest of the weekend, and there wasn't any drop-off in the viewer's interest.
Yeah, there was a buzz.
Yeah.
Town was buzzing.
Yeah. Then we could transition to when you came down to Nashville to take a look at that topic in the South, and we did a multi-part series that week, and it was also the same interest in the community. Within a couple of months, the other television stations in town decided that the UFO topic was not taboo to them, and they ventured into that. But it's for me the interest of the viewers in Las Vegas, and I'm assuming just based on other surveys that have been people around the world in the topic, that in itself is worthy of another 5-part series to understand that need and interest, and as we move forward, I understand that my generation watched Flash Gordon talking to his watch, or Dick Tracy talking to his watch, and now we do that. The same thing was going on with the UFOs, rather than this mythology, tabloidism. A real journalist is looking at this topic, and I'm comfortable now. This is good information.
You know, that first series was a success for us as a TV station, viewership, and then a 2-hour special was a success.
Right.
We did a follow-up series in February of 1990,
Okay.
also a success.
Yes.
Got nothing but grief from our media brethren, our colleagues in Las Vegas and elsewhere, but public couldn't get enough of it, and it started a stampede. To Area 51 by the world's media. Buses went out there, tourists went out there, aviation buffs out there. It's never stopped. And here, 30 years later, it's in movies and books and television shows and on T-shirts and ashtrays. The Little Alien, the Rachel Bar and Grill becomes the Little Alien. The extraterrestrial highway is dedicated by the state of Nevada. The Las Vegas 51's baseball team. We just came from a sandwich shop, Matt and I, where they were serving the Area 51 sandwich. We should have had a piece of all that, Bob.
Well, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and I can't think of another. You have other places around the world that are interesting, Great Wall of China, the Eiffel Tower, the Notre Dame, different places. This is a patch of land out in the middle of the Nevada desert, in the central Nevada desert. But it goes back not to that spot, but people want to get close to this topic. They want to get it, they want to feel UFOs. They want to feel what is as much as they can touch, and to be there, and maybe they'll see something as the heart of UFOs. It doesn't surprise me. In some sense, the entertainment industry, whether it's Independence Day or the History Channel, would get into these topics. But it's more the public's interest. More of the public just can't seem to get enough of it. And what they're looking for is facts. As much as there's enough mythology in UFO land, and so Area 51 is a fact.
Well, for the next 20 years, mainstream media tend to dismiss it still and make fun of it and not give it fair coverage. December of 2017, the New York Times covers it. Holy cow, there really has been secret UFO studies. The Pentagon has been digging into this stuff. There are now there are indications that there really are materials from somewhere else stashed in hangars somewhere that are being analyzed. And it feels like we're on the cusp of a new understanding of this, but suddenly it's respectable 30 years later to report on it and discuss it.
Well, as I meant, the idea that we approach this topic with traditional journalistic guidelines of double checking, of two sources, of making sure that we had the best evidence. It has taken a while, but it started at Channel 8, and now it has moved to the New York Times, to say 30 years later. But it traveled around the world well before the New York Times.
It's amazing how far it went and how well that story is known and its place in cultural history. And people in Africa and Australia and Europe and South America know about Area 51.
Yeah. Somebody wants to give me a credit card rate. Also, my student loan, I can get a free student loan.
Yeah, just amazing how big it became.
Thank you. I think when that first five-part series, the first five-part series you did, we were getting enough solid local reaction to continue with this story, but also it was a fact that there were still a lot of unanswered questions that were bugging us that we needed answered. So we had those two things that were going. And then when the five-part series, the reaction to that.
9-part.
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 9 parts, multi-minute. I still had questions about this topic, because as we do the research in it, you find so much garbage, so much National Enquirer crap that's out there. But I will tell you, even amongst some of the garbage reporting, there would be one little piece of information that there may have been a nugget, there may have been something in there that you could add to this or that.
Well, yeah, it's daunting to separate wheat from chaff in this field.
Yeah.
It draws profiteers and crazy people and people with wild imaginations like nothing else.
Well, and it's also, I think though that there were already people within the UFO research industry, cottage industry, that were credible. But they just couldn't. They couldn't be heard. They didn't have the resources, and so when we came along, it helped them with their stories. And I'm sure that you were approached at any number of times and met any number of these people that had been trying to sell this story, that weren't the crazies, that weren't the profiteers. They were regular human beings that had been doing a lot of work, and were solid people, but just as much as they waved their hands, they couldn't be heard. And I think that you gave voice to those people. You may not have interviewed them, but the fact is, when somebody else would look at their research, they say, "Oh well, maybe."
Here's another factor that I think can't be ignored. You hate to mention it, but it was fun. That stuff's fun. For work, it's not really work. It was fun digging into that.
Well, I don't want to say covering organized crime was fun, but if we include in the word fun, exciting, and fulfilling, I mean, covering organized crime, covering UFOs, fun would be a word, but we need a bigger word than that.
Yeah.
It was fulfilling in a lot of ways, that we're covering ground that should be covered and nobody else is covering. As a matter of fact, people laugh at this organized crime. Oh no, that's real serious. And kudos for covering organized crime. Well, you guys are really tough on that. But UFOs, in some ways, took more courage to cover that, because a lot of the media would laugh at you. Fun, yeah, but it was exciting, fulfilling. You look back and you say that was time well spent. Now there may be some other things that may have not been well spent, but time doing that was well spent.
Okay, so Bob at the end there says time well spent. He says, yeah, that he was concerned. He wanted to make sure this was time well spent, because he wanted to balance. At that time, the mob reporting here in town was a big deal, and he wanted to balance the two and make sure that it was on air time well spent plus your time well spent, which I think now we can say history has borne out that it was time well spent.
Yeah, the audience reacted in a big way. We saw it immediately, and it built through the first week of that series. It got bigger and bigger as we got closer to identifying Bob Lazar, and then had a couple more parts with him, and then we looked at UFOs and religion and the cover-up aspect, and asking questions about why it would be kept secret. And these are questions that all of us have, everybody has. So it was a big hit, but it wasn't just for ratings. It was because we wanted to know. We wanted to know ourselves.
And you can see those stories, by the way. UFOs, the best evidence, on MysteryWire.com. You can go back and take a look at each of those stories. We have in February part 2 of that series coming up, and another wealth of knowledge and information that we're looking forward to releasing at that time. Now, okay, you talk about Bob's. We got a lot of Bob's. Bob Stoddall, Bob Lazar, Bob Bigelow. Now, there's we've got some stuff we're going to put out on the Mystery Wire YouTube page. So this is where I'm going to plug the social media. Like, go on, get a Twitter page. We have Instagram, we have Facebook, and we have a YouTube page. We're going to exclusively put some video with Bob Bigelow on YouTube initially, and he's going to tell us what, George?
Well, let me tell you who Bob Bigelow is first.
Yes.
I think he's maybe the most important person in the history of the UFO study, because he's spent more money than any individual in the history of the world on pursuit of this topic. Tens of millions of dollars out of his own pocket to figure it out. He established his own scientific institute, the National Institute for Discovery Science, in the 90s. He had a program, got a contract from the Defense Intelligence Agency in the aughts that was looking at Skinwalker Ranch, UFOs, cattle mutilations, a lot of related topics. He is still deeply interested in this. But since December of 2017, when the New York Times came out with this blockbuster story about the existence of a program called ATIP, the release of these videos through Tom DeLonge and his To the Stars Academy that have been verified by the U.S. government as being legit and from the U.S. Navy. Bob Bigelow hasn't said anything. He's made comments before. He was interviewed famously on 60 Minutes where he said, I think the aliens are already here, and I don't care whether anybody thinks I'm crazy or not. But since December of 2017, he's made no public comments about the UFO scene. I got a chance to sit down with him. We interviewed him about his space program, about Bigelow Aerospace and endeavors and projects it's got going with NASA. And in the middle of that, I asked him, hey, what do you make of the scene here, the ATIP, OSAP news, all the attention, the coverage that it's getting from mainstream media? And we are going to put that clip, that 5-minute conversation on our YouTube page, and that's where it's going to be sort of the world premiere.
Good. No, looking forward to it. Go to YouTube and subscribe to Mystery Wire. And it's very early on. We're building subscribers up in all of our social media. It's a great way for us to be able to keep in touch with you on what we're putting up from the stuff from 30, 40 years ago and new stuff that we're putting up. And there seems to be a desire through NASA, is getting Bob Bigelow and other people involved with the space station, the space hotel. Elon Musk and SpaceX are involved in a race to the moon. Want to get back to the moon to be able to set up a base there. I guess that eventually goes to Mars from there, but initially, is this not fascinating too? We cover that topic, current space science and military technology stuff on the website.
Yeah, not only do all UFO roads lead to Las Vegas, but the space tech roads lead here as well. Not all of them, but some of them. And Bigelow is at the forefront of the space entrepreneurs, these billionaires who want to fund their own space programs. He's right in the thick of it. He wants to build basically his own orbiting space station that would be above the moon, that would serve as a base for other lunar operations. And there's a chance NASA is going to give him that contract. We have a bunch of other space-related stories. It seems like a golden age for private enterprise and endeavors in space, like Bigelow, and those are on the Mystery Wire. We're posting those kind of stories every day as well. We also added a military tech story this past week about the F-117. If you thought the stealth fighter was done, if you thought it had been retired, which is the official story from the U.S. government, the Air Force said, we're putting them in mothballs. That was in 2008. Here we are 11 years later, and people keep saying, I've just seen an F-117. I've just seen a Nighthawk flying over my town or flying over the desert here, and there are videos and photos. So we looked into what's the evidence? Is it really flying around? If so, how many? And if so, what are they doing? Talked to a couple of the military watchdog folks who have their own websites and follow this stuff closely and put a story together, and people should be able to see that on the website momentarily.
Okay, and that is, everybody knows now Area 51, certainly. You helped bring that to light of what Area 51. There's also an Area 52 that's just north of that, Tonopah, right, if you will, in the middle of Nevada. Would you say that's pretty much in the middle of the state?
Smack dab in the middle.
And that's where the F-117, the stealth fighters.
Yeah, so the first flight of the stealth fighter, the F-117, was at Groom Lake. And once it becomes operational, they move things to Tonopah, the Area 52, the Tonopah test range. It's got 50 or 60 hangars out there. A lot of the mothballed F-117s are in some of the hangars, but what's in the rest of the hangars is unknown. There's likely another secret platform that's being developed out there. It might be operational by now. If they follow the pattern with the F-117, they would fly it only at night so nobody gets a good look at it or gets photos. But something big appears to be underway out there. And then there are other satellite bases out in the desert, and you wouldn't see it unless you go out there with night vision at night and hold up the glasses, and you can see indications of facilities that do not appear on any map, that are not necessarily officially part of the Tonopah test range, but they're out there nonetheless, working on secret stuff.
Okay, you talk about maps. Google Maps is pretty effective. Certainly, what they've been able to do, and they can get shots of me sunbathing in my. They're horrible shots. Nobody wants to see them, but in my backyard, kicking back. Let's say attending to the garden in the backyard, and if I'm out there at the right time at the right place, it'll snapshot and you can go and you can zoom in.
I'm trying to get that image out of my head.
It's horrible. It's awful. Anyway, so what does Google Maps show? Area 51, Area 52. If you were to go to those sites and look at them, what are you going to see?
Well, it's interesting. There's a recent piece that we're putting on the website about censorship by Google, by Google Earth, and it's been that way for a long time. It was suspicious in the beginning that look at that cloud right over Area 51, just stuck right there at the exact moment that they're taking these pictures, or the smudge over Area 52. Some very smart people have figured out it's not an accident, that it's been that way for a long time, but that for years Google has effectively censored any accurate imagery of those particular areas. And it's the only place, I think, in the whole world that that's true for.
And they're doing it at the request, certainly, of the U.S. government. Okay, they're not just picking a spot. Somebody from the federal government had gone to Google at some point and went to Silicon Valley and said, oh, by the way, we don't want this up, or maybe an or else, maybe I don't know if they can do an or else, but at least, yeah, that's where that had to come from.
Yeah, I would think so. I think there was a phone call or a conversation. I don't know if it got to the point where it had to be a threat. You know, those big companies like that, they all work with the government. They get government contracts, and I think there's probably more than one quid pro quo floating around the world these days. But yeah, it's no question that it's happened. It's been underway for at least 7 or 8 years.
Okay, so we got some of the stuff coming up here on this website, on MysteryWire.com. A preview. Don't miss this weekend. Probably put it up Friday. We'll put that video up Friday.
Bigelow.
Bob Bigelow talking about everything he's done and where he's going with some of the stuff, with some of these programs that we were unaware of that the government had. And he was involved. He had to be aware of them. He was part of them. He was right there in the mix.
Yeah, he was right in the mix. He got the contract. He created something called BAS, Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Systems, and it got the contract from the DIA, a program called OSAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapons. I forget what the whole acronym thing is, but that was the contract that was awarded to him. It eventually evolved or morphed into what we now know as ATIP, which is a much smaller program with a much smaller focus that looks at military encounters with unknown aircraft. But Bigelow's program was much broader, much bigger.
Is anything slowing down for you right now, George? You did Coast to Coast over the weekend. You got this podcast now. Obviously doing MysteryWire.com, the website. Nothing seems to be slowing down.
Yeah,
you have enough time in a day to get
everything.
Here in
my old age, I'm kicking back and relaxing, you know. So
yes.
It's an exciting time. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Well, I know there's a lot of people that depend on you, seriously, and there's a lot of people that look to you and listen to you, and you've gained that. You've earned that trust, certainly over the years, with the viewers and with the listeners here. So go to MysteryWire.com and check out the latest and greatest. Hope you enjoyed the Bob Stodahl interview. More to come. We'll be back every week, and we'll try to throw an interview in of some sort, too. Also let you hear from some people. We'll also do some live phone calls. We'll get that going here on the podcast where we can call in some people. You got some friends out there that will come on with us, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You got a couple that,
yeah,
okay.
We'll wrangle with you.
Tom DeLonge, bring his guitar in and we'll play some music and talk aliens or something.
Okay.
So, all right.